Hey team, this is Coach Brandon with 1780 Fitness and Martial Arts. Today's whiteboard lecture is on nonverbal communication and what we can do to see violent assaults and attacks coming. So we'll talk a little bit about verbal communication, nonverbal communication, conflicts, and then what kind of things we see that precede violent assaults. So we'll start with verbal. So verbal consists of content and tone. Content, what I say, literally the words that are coming out of my mouth. And often we spend a great deal of our time kind of carefully crafting our content. Then we've got tone. That's how we sound. And another way of expressing tone for me is the words that we don't say but that people hear. So often if we say, can you get down from there? There are some unflattering words behind that we kind of hear in the tone, but which aren't actually said. Nonverbal. Now, nonverbal is actually the bulk of human communication. We get most of what we perceive from others through nonverbal communication. So that will consist of gestures, largely, macro and micro gestures, and then things that are conscious and then subconscious. So macro gestures are what I like to focus on because micro gestures can be very difficult to detect under stress when things are moving or changing rapidly, or when you even have a situation with low lighting where you simply can't see those micro gestures. Those might include, for light-skinned people, flushing around the eyes and nose when they get agitated or when they're lying. For darker-skinned people, they might appear ashen around the eyes and nose. But again, those things can be tough to pick up on kind of on the fly. Conscious and subconscious, right? That flushing that I just talked about, trembling. Those kinds of things are subconscious. There's nothing we can do about them, right? They just kind of come out. So some gestures are conscious, like the ones I'm making now. You know, my hands are up here, they're above the waist, and there's a reason that I'm here, right? So I kind of practice having my hands above my waist. Any big gesture or a point, you know, those things are certainly conscious gestures. Now, when it comes to these things and indicating deception, which might be somebody planning an attack, somebody planning a theft or a robbery against us, kind of in close quarters, we really need to look for conflicts in between content, tone, and nonverbals or gestures. And those things will often be indicators of deception coming at us. To give an example, if I tell you, hey, I'm not starting any trouble, right? And all of that matches. My tone matches, my content matches my nonverbals. As opposed to, hey, I'm not starting any trouble, but where I make some big, I'm over exaggerating here, but some big gestures that belie the content. Looks like I'm about to start trouble, right? We'll come back to this in just a minute. So we're going to go over to the kind of gestures that I like to pick up on and to focus on. And we'll hear different people call these different things. Sometimes we'll hear them referred to as grooming gestures, and I've heard people speak in absolutes where if they do this, then this happens. I prefer not to think that way. I prefer to look at what's often, not always, behind the gestures and what that might mean for us if we are about to be the victim of a violent assault. So we have what I call self-soothing gestures. So these are often big things that I might see. The person might be unconscious or subconsciously producing these gestures. So arm folding. So if you see this, a lot of times we're told in nonverbal communication classes this might mean that somebody's closed off or that they're insecure, but I like to think of this as kind of a big hug, as a self-soothing thing. You'll see people who are very stressed very often do this. They'll even kind of squeeze tightly. Head and face wiping, some variation of this kind of a gesture, right? Again, for me, that indicates they're self-soothing. They're stressed. They're doing this to kind of mitigate some of that stress and to soothe themselves a little bit. Nose and face touching, simple things like this, right? So this kind of eye thing or this kind of eye covering, these gestures are often there to soothe or to conceal behavior. Deep, steady breath. You'll see that kind of a thing. So that's often someone steadying themselves, someone soothing themselves. Now this could mean that they're simply realizing they're in a very bad situation. It could mean that they're preparing themselves to act. Preparatory gestures, and these are the big ones, right? And we'll talk about how these things get combined in just a bit. So hands above the waist, like I've been, right? So you'll see me doing a few of these preparatory gestures simply because I practice them, especially in interactions with people that I don't know. I want my hands above my waist because if I need to react, they're in a much better position than if I'm just down here with my arms and shoulders relaxed. I also want my body bladed. So I want my non-dominant foot slightly forward. I want my dominant leg in the back. Why do we do that? Because if we need to react, if we need to fight, that's a position that we want to be in. Other people do it for the same reason. We need to be aware of that. Proximity changes, right? In America, especially overall in the West, we have a social talking distance somewhere around 3 or 4 feet. If people start getting close enough to reach you, though, that can become a problem, especially if you don't know them and you're in a less than ideal situation. I'll give you an example here in just a bit. Target glancing. So we see this often in law enforcement. Do you have any drugs or guns in the car? No. Quick look down at the center console, right? So that target glancing can be something that we really need to look at. If somebody were thinking of robbing you or taking your purse or a bag, they might look at it, right? They might continually glance at it, and that's target glancing. Scanning. So looking around the area. Now, scanning is something we recommend that you practice because that's the first step in indicating or in detecting any kind of a violent assault or a stimuli coming in at you. But people might also do it because they want to see if the environment is secure, if the environment is something that they want to be a bad actor in. Confirmation touch. So that confirmation touch is something that can kind of be a self-soothing gesture, but it can also be preparatory. So if I had a gun tucked into my waistband and I were going to use it, right, I might want to touch that to make sure it's still there. And when I work security and I'm looking for people that are carrying concealed, that's a big thing that I'll look for. I'll look for those common touches, which might be the low of the back, might be the appendix, might be on the hip. So I'll look for them continually touching those areas, and that often gives me an indicator that they might be holding something. But again, concealed carry, right? If you carry concealed carry, how often do you do the touch? You know, there it is. You're checking to make sure that the weapon is still there, and that's just kind of a way for you to kind of self-soothe and confirm, hey, it is in fact still there. So these are, again, big gestures that we can typically pick up on. What I like to tell people to look for are combinations of these gestures. So in one of the videos that I often teach, we see this big head wipe, arm fold, and a body blade. And after that, when we see those kinds of things, very often it's pretty much on. Give an example from my life when I encountered a situation where I saw these big soothing gestures preceding preparatory gestures. I used to work in law enforcement, and I was on the midnight shift. Often I would go out to Walmart because it was the only place that was open. It's kind of where I go to entertain myself and kill some time. One night, I saw a woman walking out of Walmart. She's looking down at her phone while she's walking. I recognized that might be a problem, so I kind of looked out for her. I see another guy walk between the cars and then turn walking toward her. Now, that made me a little bit nervous because where was he coming from? I didn't exactly see where from. The first preparatory gesture that I saw, he scanned. He looked around him, and I went, ruh-roh. So that might be a problem. So as he walks up to her, his hands come above his waist. I see him smile, right? To me, that's another preparatory gesture in this instance. He says, ma'am, and she looks up pretty startled because they're only about 6-7 feet apart by that time, and he keeps walking toward her. He says, do you have the time? I noticed he was wearing a watch, and he actually tapped it. So maybe his watch was dead, yeah, maybe so. But kind of a giveaway, right? That maybe he wasn't maybe he was up to no good. He keeps walking toward her, gets very close. She starts to that startle response. So that sudden approach gives her this, ooh, what is this? She still hasn't said anything. She's kind of frozen. If you see our decision cycle video, we talk about kind of how and why that happens. So while she's there, in this pause, he says, do you have the time? Right? And I see this, so he hasn't seen me yet, apparently. I said, hey, buddy, it's about 2:30 in the morning. He looks at me. He looks back at her. She looks at me, looks back at him. Now they're kind of in this loop. They're in this observe-orient part of the decision cycle. He certainly doesn't want this attention. So I said again, hey, buddy, it's about 2:30 in the morning. He says, is there anything else that you need? He looks at her, looks at me again, shakes his head no, and walks off. Right? Probably not solid. He didn't walk toward the store. He walked back through the parking lot. So I got on the phone, called JSO, called in a suspicious person, made sure she got to her car after talking to her very quickly, and then went in Walmart and got my stuff done. So those preparatory gestures are very often there. So that scanning, he didn't really have a lot of self-soothing gestures. That led me to believe he might be somebody that's pretty used to this kind of behavior. So he was already pretty confident in his approach. But these are things that we need to look for kind of on the big scale. We do all of this so that we can intercept intention and so that we don't have to intercept action. So when I say intercept intention, if I start to see these self-soothing gestures pair up with these preparatory gestures, then I'm already ahead of the curve because I'm already thinking, what's this person's intention? When I'm already thinking that way, I can start to formulate a plan right now. I need to move away. I need to create distance. Distance and time equal opportunity, so that gives me more options concerning what I can do. Intercept action. If I wait, if I don't see these nonverbal communication and conflicts happening between their tone, their content, the nonverbal communication, then I'm probably going to be in a position where I can only react to action, like she did. He approached her, ma'am, do you know what time it is? Oh, her reaction is, it's a startle response, right? She didn't have a planned or a well-trained response by that point, but she was entirely reacting. When I can intercept intention and see these things coming, I can become the actor rather than the reactor. It's always better to be the actor rather than the reactor. So as always, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments here or message us directly, and we'll be happy to get to those. Between now and then, take care of each other and stay safe.